Sadashiva Samarambam Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam Ishvaro Guratmeti Murti Veda Vibhagine Vyomabda Vyapta Dehaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha Sava Vedanta Sedanta Gocharam Tamagocharam Govindam Paramanantam Satguru Pranatoshmaham Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti Om. So, welcome to our Vivekachudamani. We begin today from the verse 60. Okay? When the negation of the koshas is done by logical inquiry based on the scripture, awareness is isolated and known to be the self. So the negation of the koshas is done, as we know, the very, very structure of dividing the human experience in 5 different levels. They're called the sheets or koshas, which is nothing but different dimensions or realms or types of human experience with which the jiva gets identified. The jiva defines itself through those different levels of physical, energetic, emotional, and intellectual, and so on, and the peace and the bliss of Anandamaya Kosh. So we have these different kinds of human experience, and we very easily we define ourselves through our own experience. So we get attached to those koshas, and the koshas, after all, they need to be looked in very carefully, so that we can understand that we are none of those experiences, which relates to our individual kind of existence or experience. But we need to do that negation. Basically, we negate everything when we come to Vedanta, until we are left with that which cannot be negated, as we know now, which is one of the ways to look into the self, that which is not subject to negation. So, but we can negate, and we're going to negate this the lower self, let's say like that, the koshas. And how are we going to do that? We're going to do that through the intellect, because only the intellect can do this analysis, and discrimination between what is permanent and what is impermanent, what is always present and what come and go. So it has to be the intellect, and the intellect it must follow a certain analysis or certain logic, and there is no better way to do this discrimination and this negation of the false sense of the self than by following the logic as presented by the Upanishads. So we are here to follow the logic of the scripture, and therefore the verse says that when the negation of the koshas is done by logical inquiry based on the scripture, what happens? Awareness is isolated and known to be the self. So I like very much this expression about isolating consciousness, isolating the self, because as we know, the self, it pervades media, it pervades all bodies, all objects, objects sentient and inert. So consciousness is pervading everything. So how can we isolate something that pervades something else, you know? So we have space. The space pervades all objects of media. So now how can we isolate space so that we can understand that space is a factor that somehow does not change? And the objects within space, they keep changing. So we need to do this isolation. And of course, this isolation is not something that can be done physically, but it needs to be done in our understanding. And this isolation of the self, we go about doing that, and by saying, no, I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not the body, I'm not this, I'm not my physiological functions, I'm not my emotions, I'm not my thoughts. And so we go just negating all these different kind of these categories of experience, you know, on a bulk, let's say, on a bulk. Because if you would have to negate all objects that somehow appears within the scope of our consciousness, that would be a job that would be not possible to do in many lifetimes, you know. So we need to classify these objects with which we identify big time. We really identify. It's not so easy to identify with my own car, identify with my TV, you know, with my cat, you know, with my house. We have certain degrees of identification even with these physical objects, but with our experiences, you know, the ones directly relate to our body-mind construct, you know, the physical, the pranic, and the mental, emotional, intellectual experience. So all those experiences, it's so easy for the self to get mixed up and confused. Why? Because the self is there in each one of those experiences, because it's pervading all of them. Now, how can we isolate the self? You know, if the self gets mixed up with everything, because the self is the substratum of everything. So it requires, as we know, a very subtle mind, because we are kind of isolate something that is unperceptible. You know, we cannot perceive the self the way we perceive thoughts, for example. Thoughts, objects, they are very subtle objects, but still we perceive thought. You know, we perceive the intellect, we perceive the deep sleep. You know, we know that we do perceive it, you know, but we cannot perceive consciousness, because consciousness belongs to a different order of reality. But this being Satya, the only reality, and being Mithya, a superimposition in Satya, so we need to isolate something that is pervading, you know, all the objects of Mithya. So therefore, this is a discrimination or isolation that needs to be done through the intellect, and the intellect needs to be subtle enough, you know, qualified or purified enough, because this is a very subtle kind of isolation or discrimination, you know. I'm discriminating the light of consciousness, the light of the illuminator from all the objects that are illumined, and revealed by this light of conscious. My conscious existence reveals everything within myself, and that's the point. So, and why we say that it needs to be isolated, although this isolation is not really something physical. It needs to be isolated because the self, due to this power called Maya, it got confused with these five koshas. It got confused with the human experiences, you know, the jiva's experience, you know, and the jiva thinks, oh, I am the body, I'm fat, I'm this, I'm hot, I'm cold, you know, and I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm depressed. No, I'm sharp, I'm clear, I'm unclear, I'm blissful. So this I, it's the common denominator of all our experience. And in this I, if we don't isolate this I and the understanding and understand what this I refers to, this I is going to remain attached to all these experience, and the experience are going to become the I, you know, the I that thinks, the I that determines, the I that, you know, that it's heavy today, it's fat tomorrow, it's tall, it's short, you know, it's white, it's black. So all these uh, aspect is properties or attributes relate to the body-mind construct. So this isolation is absolutely necessary. You know, it's without this isolation, nothing is possible. Although there is only the self, this superimposition of names and forms and makes it in a way that the self, because the Jivatma is Paramatma after all, as we know that. So Jivatma tends to believe that he is mixed up with the experience. And then, oh no, this is me, but the body is me, everything is me. But there is room for confusion. And then we really need to isolate this consciousness as the light in which presence things are illumined and known, you know. So this is very important, and it's it's also important that we don't stop at isolating the self, but maybe even as important is to claim our identity as the light in which present objects are illumined, revealed, and known, right? So isolating, discriminating, separating is as important as claiming, you know, claiming with full conviction that I am the light of the illuminator. None of these objects that are being revealed and illumined by this light. So that is basically the entire process of Vedanta is to discriminate, isolate, and claim it is the light of the illuminator to be my true nature, my true identity. Then one can enjoy that freedom, because freedom is the nature of consciousness. This light, it does not change, it does not modify your experience. So it's the only freedom there is. So there is no circumstance of the camp that the Dharma field, you know, that could affect this conscious existence, which is our true nature. And this discrimination, of course, and this isolation is something that it needs to follow us through the day. And I wish and I hope that this vasana is growing in each one of us, you know, because it has to be there. It needs to be there because this confusion imposed by Maya is very tough. So we need to carry on this isolation and this discrimination between the light of the illuminator and the object. Somehow it has to remain in the background of our minds, you know. I mean, you can go about doing that even with a certain element of experience itself, because the moment that you remember the light of the illuminator, immediately you can feel it shine in your intellect, you know. So, you know what I'm talking about, you guys? That the moment that you keep in mind, you know, that you are the light that shines in the intellect, immediately you not only you isolate, separate yourself from the intellect, but you start having that feel, you know, of this light that shines in your intellect, right? So this is our doing. So we say that the Vedantins, they don't do anything. So our exercise of sadhana is extremely subtle, and it is a kind of intellectual activity of discriminating, separating, isolating, and claiming I am this light, and I'm shining on this intellect here, you know. And then you look at the others and say, oh, and I'm shining there, I'm shining there, I'm shining there, I'm shining on all beings. You know? So that's the point. The word Atma is usually translated as the self, because it says that awareness is isolated known to be the self. This consciousness is the self. So, because the self, this self is nothing but is the I, the I. So the I, in truth, is consciousness, and we take the I to be our sense of doership, our ego sense of authorship, and so on. So we have this I that somehow it takes the shape of different aspects of the individual body-mind complex. But this word Atma is usually translated as the I, because it's the same I. It may shine on the cat. I'm the cat now because the cat never says I, the cat. Right? But any human jiva has this I sense. I exist, and I interact with my environment. So it doesn't matter. Any mind, any intellect has this I. So in this I is the only self there is. Of course, the more gross this sense of I is, that the less is the possibility to understand that there is only one I. So this sense of I, this sense of individuality, it needs to be refined enough to begin understanding these notions, that there is only one I appearing in the intellect of every human jiva as I, and unfortunately, it appears as I, the body-mind complex, right? I, the body-mind complex, but there is only one I, and the I is not the body-mind complex. The body-mind complex is nothing but energy / matter. It's all about inert matter, inert energy, right? So there is only one I. And this I is the self, Atma. In Vedic literature, we find Atma being used to describe the body or the prana or the mind. So it says that within the Vedic, not in the Vedantic, the Vedic in general, we find many times the self being described as the body, the body, the prana maya, the manomaya, anomaya. So all these mayas, you see that in all these koshas, we have the maya there, Ananda maya and the Vijnana maya. So they are all product of maya. It's all a misidentification of the I with different aspects of this experience, the jiva experience. So the Vedic literature, we find Atma being used to describe the body, or prana, or the mind, or the intellect, or even the pranamaya. So we have the Anandamaya. It's not that the meaning of the word changed, but rather that the understanding of the self occurs on different levels. So we can say that I have a different understanding of my I. So, and when I'm highly elevated spiritually, as we say, I begin to identify with what? I begin to identify with my Vijnana Maya Kosha and my Ananda Maya Kosha, because I'm just, I'm just contemplating on these very beautiful intellectual notions about the nature of reality, the nature of the self. Excuse me, let me close this. So we have all these different sense of I, and we take the I to be this different because we somehow identify with it. And the more we grow spirits, the more we identify with the pranamaya, with the Vijnana Maya or the Ananda Maya, no? Because now I just left the food body I left behind, the pranas and the emotions and the thoughts, and now I'm identifying with my fine, refined intellect and with those beautiful states that are byproduct of a very subtle, refined intellect. And then I start having these nice, beautiful states, intellectual states, mental states, and then I begin identifying with those. So it's all all of this is I, but all of this, as we know, is I under the spell of Maya. That's why it's Pranamaya, Manomaya, etc. Etc. Maya, Maya, Maya. It's just an illusion, not real. So the I is the same, but it goes through this apparent experience that brings about these different levels of misidentification. The five koshas are, in sense, five atmas or five selves, or we can mistake the self for any of these sheets as they are called. As the text leads us through a consideration of the nature of each one of these sheets, we realize that they are not limitless and they are not really of the nature of joy. But when we come to really experience the I'm having trouble with this word today. Anandamaya kosha, when we start really analyzing the experience of Anandamaya kosha, say, wait a moment, I mean, it's really joyful up there, It's really joyful. So what are you talking about, scripture? Saying that the five sheets are not limitless and the five sheets are not of the nature of joy, peace, and love, and so on. And which is, by the way, limitless is the nature of the self. The self is Satchitananda, it's the existence consciousness, and it's the I that is, the I that is conscious, and it's the I that's limitless. But those experience with a little bit of objection, we could, we say, in regards to Anandamaya kosha, we know that the intellect cannot really give us satisfaction in the physical body and the prana. So when we identify to any one of these aspects of our human experience, we don't feel really joyful because things change from one moment to another. And joy comes only when we have a sense of stability and security and peace, and so on. So, but we have this experience of joy that comes from Anandamaya kosha that therefore is so easily mistaken to be the self. That's why we have the largest number of people in the spiritual world. They believe that Anandamaya kosha is the self because it has a nice, beautiful sense of limitless and joy attached to it. Will you agree, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely, Arlindo. Yeah.
So we realize that they are not really limitless. And why Anandamaya kosha is not limitless? Why it's not really totally joyful? I mean, to begin with, it's because it does not stay forever. It comes and goes. And sometimes it takes a lot of work to produce it. The Anandamaya kosha of deep sleep is almost useless. It only serves to refresh and rejuvenate a little bit our body-mind construct because there is no way we can really grow. If we could grow by sleeping, deeply sleeping, so we would have some people that I know that sleep 10, 12 hours a day, they would be spiritually very elevated, But as we know, if they sleep too much, the opposite tends to happen because the person begins growing with tamas, and the mind becomes dull and not really a mind fit for spiritual growth, So the Anandamaya kosha that we get from those experience of deep meditation or of samadhi and so on, they are not really of the nature of joy because it takes a lot of time to produce it, a lot of effort, and then you already had to work hard for getting something which is not very joyful. Most people, if you have to work to get another kosha by gaining a new house, you have to deal with the fact for many years you're going to have to work very, very hard and save a lot of money so that you can buy a bigger house, a better house, and so on. So all this another kosha comes already with a lot of downsides to it, and then they are not really a source of joy because they don't last as well. The moment that you are joyful, you can just you enter in that kind of state knowing that around the corner rajas and tamas are going to somehow mess up that nice balance of the sattvic mind, and then things change, things begin changing. One start going down, coming out of that state. So it is, but it's not, but it's better than not having those fleeting moments of joy in any case, we appreciate those moments when they come. But as we know, there is a nature of the self, which is joy, which is not, it does not really refer to the experiential joy of Anandamaya Kosha, but the intellectual joy of the knowledge, I am beyond the koshas. This intellectual knowledge, I am Sat Chitananda, it produces the sense of limitless in the jiva, which is not attached to the experience of bliss, you understand? But it's attached to the certainty of knowledge, I am the limitless. You understand this point? It's subtle, but it's very, very important. These two aspects of this Anandamaya Kosha, the one that is attached to the experience of the self shining in a sattvic mind, and one that is attached to the certainty of knowledge. I am the limitless Ananta, Satchitananda. I'm the limitless consciousness. And that knowledge, it produces an Ananta that does not depend on the sattvic mind. The mind can turn more rajasic and tamasic, but that knowledge is always present because it is very properly retained, integrated, and so on. Which is the definition of the self. The Atma provides in the first verse. The first verse of Vivekachudamani, it begins saying that the self is of the nature of joy. And then it goes about saying it's of the nature of security and so on. So we know that the self is of the nature of joy. But we know that the self is not an experiencing entity, which is different. You understand? So we can never say, for example, what is the nature of fire? The nature of fire is heat. And as we know, heat burns everything it comes in contact with, right? But we can never say that the fire really burns someone, Understand? The fire does not do an action of burn anyone. The fire does not have an experience of burning anyone. The fire does not even have an experience of illuminating anything. Understand? It's just that burning is the nature of the fire. So likewise, our true nature is of the nature of limitlessness. And this limitlessness is not a doing, and it's not an experience, it's a nature. And once this is clearly understood, and then we can understand what Ramji means to say when he says that always that knowledge is that which is always good. You understand? Because it does not fluctuate once it is properly assimilated, right? Each kosha represents a misidentification, levels of human experience we identify with due to what? Due to this Maya. This is avidya operating in the mind of the jiva that compels the jiva atma to identify with the five koshas, with the three bodies. One by one, the sheets are stripped away by logic until all that remains is the self as the witness of this process of discrimination. So we are discrimination, we are doing our work, and there is a light of consciousness, yeah, that is making possible this very process of discrimination. We call this witnessing principle. We may call it the light of the illuminator. We can call it so many different ways, but fundamentally it is our very nature, you know, this awareness, this consciousness, you know, this existence of ours. One by one, these sheets are stripped away by logic until all that remains is the self as the witness of the entire process of discrimination and isolation of the self, that which cannot be negated. And we're going to say, no, not the self, not the self, not the self, not the self. Now try to really negate the witnessing conscious principle, which is in truth that which is allowing the intellect to do the discrimination. No, it's impossible. The self cannot be negated, it says here. The self cannot be negated. It's what remains after we go through this process, cannot be negated. To say that I awareness do not exist requires the existence. So we can negate everything, but we cannot negate the I, because the I is the negator of everything. So how can you negate the negator? Because in order to negate the negator, you know, you need to be present as what? As the existence of the negator. No? Otherwise, how can I negate myself? Okay, the self cannot be negated. To say that I, awareness, do not exist requires the existence of the one who makes the negation and leads to an infinite regression. We cannot negate the self without another self. That's the point. Therefore, it's impossible to have a circumstance in which the self or existence is not present, you know? Self is existence. So we cannot have the situation. It's impossible, and logic proves it. What can distinguish one limitless awareness from another? So if we would take in consideration, okay, it requires another existence, another self to negate the other one, because this self here is not the real deal. We need to negate. Yes, we do it all the time. We are doing it, you know, we are negating all these koshas, and in the end, we have the intellect. The intellect is really nicely dressed up, you know, as the self. And then we have to negate the intellect. We do that. But then once we negate the intellect, so who is going to negate the negator of the intellect? You know? I mean, there's nothing beyond it. So there's no other self that's going to negate the self. Otherwise, we'd have to have so many selves, one negating the other. Oh yeah, you have to go deeper and deeper and deeper and become subtler and subtler and subtler until you come to the end of the road, and then you go through millions of selves. No, it makes no sense. Because the nature of the self is one without a second, as we know. Understand? And we can assert and we can determine and understand that by following the logics as presented by the scriptures. You know? What can distinguish one limitless self from another? There cannot be two selves. Therefore, the self is advaita, not two, no divided. The witness, the self, is in the form of knowledge. So now we present the self as what? As chit, knowledge. The self is pure knowledge, pure consciousness, and it's pure existence. And knowledge and existence, it is of the nature of limitless. There cannot be two entities, therefore the self is Advaita, not two. The witness, the self, is in the form of knowledge, pure consciousness. But this knowledge is not the knowledge of any object, of course, because the self is not an object. The self is not an object of knowledge, and we know exactly why the self is not an object of knowledge, because all objects of knowledge are known by the subject self. The self is the subject, so it cannot be objectified. But this knowledge, this consciousness that we call, knowledge and consciousness, they are synonymous. Knowledge and consciousness are synonymous. But this knowledge is knowingness principle, which is not sattva. Sattva is a power produced by Maya that which allows the jivas, it allows Ishvara to project the universe and the jivas to know the field, the Dharma field. But this knowledge is a knowingness principle, conscious principle, howsoever we want to put it. But this conscious principle, this consciousness principle, this knowing principle is not an object that one can say, oh, this is what it is. Because if the self would be reduced to an object of knowledge, he would no longer be what? Limitless, right? Why? Because we can only know things that are limited by its attributes, right? So we only can know things which are limited, defined by its attributes. The very attributes of an object limits the object, because the attributes of my physical body as a man defines me as a man. Therefore, I'm not limitless because I cannot be a woman at the same time. Understand? So anything is limited by its attributes. No matter how many attributes, in the case of the human jiva, no matter how many talents, how much knowledge, objective, scientific knowledge one may have, it's just, I'm a limit by what I know. I'm a limit by what I can do, my talents, my skills, and so on. This is what limits me. Oh, but you have so much knowledge, you have so many skills. Yeah, and the more skills and knowledge I have, more and more I feel this limitation, because knowledge uncovers more and more ignorance. I say, oh my God, now that I know this a little bit, I discover that there is a huge universe of phenomena that I have no idea, I have no knowledge about. Are you guys following? Is everything all right? So, therefore, the self is free of limitations, because the self is not an object. Otherwise, it would be limited by its attributes. And if it would be limited by its attributes, it would easily be negated, okay, as not the limitless. This knowledge or consciousness can only be of its own nature. This knowledge can only be its own nature. This knowledge is its own nature, the nature of the self, consciousness, knowledge. And this consciousness is not limited, it's formless, because it is the limitless and can be realized as one's own existence, consciousness, limitlessness. So can we understand that in truth our nature is limitless? When we really look into it, we examine it, and we just get in touch with this sense, sense of this light that shines in our intellect. It's relatively simple to understand this logic. It's a little bit less simple to hold this knowledge at all times. But if we examine a little bit, we can see that this light, it has always been present. It's present through the three states. It's present through all the koshas, because it's the one who knows all of this, you know. And it's present since our childhood until our last breath, and it does not change. We can observe as well, you know, that this conscious existence does not change, and it's the same on every one of us, you know. So it's our nature, and our nature is this limitless self, this limitless awareness, consciousness, you know, and it's shining. And our job here is to break this misidentification with the five koshas of the three bodies, because we are none of this, you know. We are not the intellect, we are not the emotion, the thoughts, and this and that. We are just that awareness or consciousness, knowledge that shines in our intellect to produce the knowing entity called Jiva. So kind of need to keep working on this and discriminating on a moment-to-moment basis until this is properly retained, because you all know this. We all know, but it needs to be a good knowledge, a knowledge that sticks and stays, you know. Yet the witness is not to be equated with the blankness of deep sleep. Yeah. For it knows itself as the awareness in which all things are known. So this witness conscious non-experience principle is not the deep sleep. For it knows itself as the awareness in which all things are known. So in fact, this witness is not to be equated with any one of the koshas, with any one of our experience. The koshas are known by the self, but they do not know the self. So can we look into that and see? Let's see if our emotions can know us. If a thought can know us, of course not. So I'm aware of my thoughts the same way that I'm aware of my hand. So my thought is not aware of me the same way my hand is not aware of me. You know? Because both are inert objects. One is dense and the other one is subtle. So the thoughts, my intellectual notions, my knowledge, you know, objective knowledge and so on, I'm aware, I know what I know. And how about my ignorance? I know what I don't know as well, you know. So knowledge, ignorance cannot really witness me and experience me. I experience and I know them, but they don't know, they don't experience me. The koshas are known by us, but they don't have any sentience. They cannot know who we are, you understand? They are just inert matter. They are not the self, and they are not the self because they are not always present. They change from a moment to a moment, and they are not conscious. They are not even reflectors, you know, with the exception of the intellect. That's why the intellect is a little bit more difficult to negate, because the intellect is the reflector. Yeah? The self shines in the intellect. Just imagine the situation there. The sun shines in the mirror, and then immediately you see, and then the sun says, oh, I mean, what is my true nature? The one inside the mirror or the one outside, you know? So it may easily get a little bit confused, but yet we have all the logic which allows us to negate the intellect as well, you know? And we prove that the intellect changes, the intellect is not always present. And the intellect, although it can perceive the field, in fact, only the intellect can really perceive its environment, because the intellect was designed to be the experienced knowing entity in respect to the field. You know? It it can perceive the environment and so on, but the self cannot, the intellect cannot perceive the self, cannot see the self, cannot really know the self. But the self knows the intellect. You understand? Because, oh, my mind, my intellect is like this, is like that, and I'm dull, and I'm very sharp right now. I'm focused, but now I'm not focused, and so on. So we know the intellect. The intellect does not know, oh, it's going to change, and so on. But yet, the intellect does not only shine with existence. Okay, everything shines with existence. My hand shines with existence. The existence of my hand is the same existence of my intellect. What is the difference between the existence of my hand and the existence of my intellect? Is my hand it shines with existence, but does not shine with reflected consciousness. My hand is not sentient, but my intellect, it shines with existence because I know the intellect exists, and the intellect knows. So therefore, the intellect is a little bit more tricky, a little bit more subtle, and more easily we misidentify with the intellect. Understand? But if we really look more carefully, and then we can see that the intellect does not know me. I know the intellect. Right, Luciana? Hmm? The koshas are known to be the self, but they do not know the self. The koshas are known by the self, but they do not know the self, nor are they the self. Yet, it is only through the self that they appear to exist. That's the interesting thing. Huh? The koshas are known by the self. They do not know the self, but fundamentally the koshas are the self. The intellect is the self. That's why we say Jivatma is Paramatma, Tatvamasi. But they somehow, they don't know it. Not even the intellect, unless the intellect is properly educated by the scriptures, the intellect is not able even to understand I am the self. Of course, the intellect cannot know the self objectively, but the intellect can know the self as I am the self, I am Brahman, Aham Brahmasmi. But unless the intellect is purified by the means of yoga and jnana, it cannot really make this isolation and discrimination and claim that, oh, I'm not the intellect, I am limitless consciousness. No? The koshas are known by the self, but they do not know the self, nor are they the self. Yet it's only through the self that they appear to exist. The self borders or lends or concedes existence and consciousness to all object, all energy, all matter. Discrimination negates all the koshas. Then negates what? The negation. For there can be no such a thing as the non-self. Oh, how nice that one. Eh? Discrimination is going to negate everything until there is something left which cannot be negated. So it means to say the only thing that's going to be left is the self. Even the negating, even the process of negating has to be given away as an object appearing within me. And that goes to say that Vedanta itself is an object, it's a tool that in the end needs to be negated as the not self. You understand? Negation is a body of knowledge that serves the purpose to negate the not self. But in the end, we need to say, okay, now that we understood, and then we understand that everything is the self. There is only the self. There is no such a thing as not self, not existence. The koshas in the end are merely the snake thin in the rope. So all these koshas is just a misapprehension of the true nature of the self. The same way we project the snake on the rope, we project those koshas on the self, and then we say, oh, the kosha is the self. If this is not entirely clear to us at this point, in the next verse, if this is not entirely clear to us at this point in the text, neither it is so for the earnest disciple who asks for further instruction in the nature of the self and will now receive it. Oh, how elegant, how beautiful this passage, huh? And how gentle, huh? I mean, the scriptures, our teachers, they are always so gentle with all of us, huh? Also encouraging. Huh? If it's not entirely clear, so please know that not even to the disciple that in the context of this text written by Shankara, so it's neither for the earnest disciple, because the moment the disciple understands I am the self, he is no longer a disciple. He knows that I am the self. Right? He is no longer a jiva. So if this is not entirely clear to us at this point in the text, neither it is to the earnest disciple who asks for further instruction in the nature of the self and will now receive it. Nice. Oh, nice. Now we left the chapter on the koshas, and we're going to enter in the chapters on the self, our essential nature. This is fun, huh, Luciana? Ruth? Now we go for the real deal. enough about being focused on the not self, not self, not self. Let's just go direct to the self now. The self-awareness can be known by anyone with discrimination. It is self-luminous. It is a partless whole, distinct from the five sheets. Witness of the three states of experience, changeless and untainted by anything that is in contact with it. So we have to really appreciate these words, because when we start talking about the not self, we don't have much to say about it. When we talk about the not self, we have a lot to say about it. When we come to the self, we need to really enjoy and chew it nicely and take our time, because there are not many beautiful words such as this verse to describe us, It says that the self is the consciousness shining in the mind of the jiva, and this consciousness can be known by anyone with a good intellect, a discriminating intellect. So the first step is to develop a discriminating, contemplating, pure or refined or intellect. So it's a good statement, and provide as well that every human jiva has a discriminating intellect. There is nobody who comes into existence without the instrument called the intellect, with its faculty of discrimination. And then as we know, opa, that's great. So if it can be known by a discriminating intellect, it means, so I'm well equipped for that, because I have a discriminating intellect. So we just need to refine it a little bit. And the fact is that this self that needs to be known by a discriminating intellect, it is self-luminous. So it does not really requires, this is a very beautiful statement. This self does not require the intellect to shine any light on him so that he is known by the intellect. You understand? How about that? Huh? Why? Because the self is the only source of light, is the only revealing power. You understand? So it's self-luminous. It does not require that the intellect sheds some light and say, oh, the self is this. So the self is self-luminous, self-evident, self-present. You know, it's so there, you know. And the intellect tries to understand its own source of light. But the self, the intellect has no source of life, the same way the moon has no light, does not have its own light, understand? So it does not have its own light. So the intellect is not able to really shed any light, but it can be purified, refined to understand, you know, that the intellect, in truth, is this self-luminous consciousness. The intellect is consciousness, and the intellect, and only the intellect, can know it, but it cannot know it by shedding light on the self and to know, oh, now I know you, I can see you. No, it can only know the self by understand I am the self. So the self is self-luminous, and it's a partless whole. It's a partless whole. So there's nothing really outside of the self. So the self cannot really know itself as an object. That's another way to look at it. You know? There is only the self. It cannot be known. And it cannot be known because there is only the self. So it cannot split itself in two so that, you know, it's just that the intellect, it believes to be a separate, independent entity searching for the self until it understands that the jiva is just like that, attached to the self, not apart from the self. You understand? Because the jiva is the self. And the only way to understand it is to understand our wholeness, you know, our non-dual nature. There is only one self. And this self is distinct from the 5 koshas, 5 sheets. So we have the term that the self is not. We went through a very extensive discrimination, separation, to make sure that we understood that the self is something totally distinct from those 5 realms of human experience. You know? And the self is that in which those experiences are known and witnessed and so on. So the self, being distinct from all experience, it witnesses all the experience, and it witnesses the 3 states of experience, the 3 mental states, the 3 states of experience, being so awake and dream and deep sleep. So the self is the only principle that is distinct from all the sheets and is distinct from the 3 states. And it is that which witnesses all the sheets and all the